It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to our roundtable on gender politics in Europe. It's the second public event in the context of our 3 days conference, Troubling Gender, organized by the Committee on Women's and Gender Studies of the German Association of European Ethnologists, in cooperation with the Committee on Europeanization and Globalization of the very same association. Many of you have followed and actively took part in the program so far, focusing on diverse geographical regions, sites, and aspects of this gender trouble. Some of you might be listening to our debates now for the first time, so welcome you as new audience. Whereas years ago, we as gender studies scholars complained to be marginalized and not heard, recently, the public and academic anxieties and debates on gender as a post-essentialist scientific concept enormously soared, but not only to our side. Rather, gender became a core element in political right-wing, anti-liberal mobilizations, unifying party politics, journalism, academia, and various religious and right-wing movements. Anti-genderism seems to be the ideological glue for conservative and far-right movements and their hegemony projects, as Esther Kovacs and Marie Perm wrote in their study on anti-gender campaigns in France, Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia in 2015. Since then, more and more governments in Europe were attracted to anti-gender politics, with severe material effects from symbolically denouncing homosexuality to retracting liberal abortion laws, closing gender studies programs, or leaving the Istanbul Convention for the protection of women against violence. In the context of the roundtable gender politics in Europe, we want to discuss how to analyze these diverse developments, how to articulate a response to them from a queer feminist perspective. What do these dynamics mean for gender studies themselves? To answer these questions, we invited 5 experts on various aspects of this trouble and with various geographical and disciplinary backgrounds. As we are all able to read the highly informative websites of our panelists, I only can recommend to you. I don't want to repeat their long publication lists and their academic career. It's fascinating. Rather, I will briefly explain why we are so delighted and grateful that these 5 experts responded to our invitation and why we wanted to have them as speakers during the roundtable on troubling gender politics in Europe. I would like to start to introduce to you Andrea Petty. Andrea Petty is professor in the department, or should I rather say was, professor in the Department of Gender Studies at the Central European University, now based at Vienna, and a Doctor of Science of the Hungarian Academy of Science. Her works on gender, politics, the Holocaust, and war have been translated into 23 languages. We invited her to the evening discussion on gender politics in Europe, not only as a professor of the first university in exile, since the CEO was banned from Hungary and over the last 2 years is operating now in Vienna. Therefore, Andrea has deep insights, I think so, in the battles and the material effects of anti-genderist discourses. And she knows what it means when they become a part and parcel of governmental policies, like in Hungary. Additionally, I got to know Andrea as a very outspoken and analytically clear and inspiring gender scholar who understands the anti-gender attacks as symbols of a much broader political project against the open society with its liberal values. Partly won, and I think we have always to remind ourselves that they were partly won or that they are there as a result of feminist and queer struggles and anti-racist struggles over the last century. In one of her papers, Andrea explores how gender studies as a profession has been changed by the ongoing anti-gender campaigns, and she's not short of an answer. Insofar, I'm highly interested in her analysis. I now would like to introduce to you the next panelist, Betül Yarar. Also, Betül Yarar is a professor in exile. She is trained as a sociologist and has worked in several Turkish universities before she had to leave the country. I think it's now 4 years ago. 4 years ago. Since then, she has worked as a senior researcher at the University of Bremen, also with the support of the Philipp Schwartz Fellowship of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. She has conducted various research projects on different aspects of gender and body politics and the women's movement in Turkey. We invited her to speak on the panel not only due to her reflections on the experience as exiled scholar, but due to her insights and expertise on the neoliberal, how you are coining it, neoliberal, neoconservative biopolitics of the Turkish AKP government and the counter strategies of the women movements in Turkey. Therefore, we are highly interested in hearing Betül's thoughts on the ongoing developments in Turkey. Now let me introduce to you Madina Tlostanova. I'm not sure how you see actually the people ordered. So I can't say now to the right or to the left. Normally we say, you know, here right to me it's sitting. But okay, Madina. Madina is professor of post-colonial feminisms with an S at Linköping University in Sweden. And I think you are very particular about this S, but perhaps you will tell us later on. She has authored over 180 articles and book chapters, lots of monographs and 3 novels translated also into many languages. We invited her because of her fascinating endeavor to bring post-colonial theory in dialogue with post-socialist thinking and realities in her project to outline what she calls Eurasian borderland feminism. In one of her articles, also together with Ruchi Tapabjorkat and Redi Kubak, I'm not sure if I pronounced it well, but please tell me later, entitled Border Thinking and Disidentification, Post-Colonial and Post-Socialist Feminist Dialogues, which I read with great pleasure, the authors introduced themselves as multiple specifically situated feminist scholars. I would like to quote this paragraph as I'm not able to better describe Madina's feminist projects. They wrote, quote, Madina is a post-colonial and post-socialist scholar at once, being born and raised in the USSR, but originating from non-Russian and non-European colonized minorities, and thinking, writing, and participating in various forms of activism as a decolonial feminist for the last 15 years. This border positioning in between academia and activism proper, as well as in between scholarly and fictional discourses, enables engagement with political art activist projects and the public sphere. This happens through participating in various learning events outside the university, organizing workshops and decolonial events in spaces beyond academia. Here I end the quote, but I think you all certainly important to read it more. Here I end, as I'm very sure that Madina will explain herself afterwards much better how all these different forms of in-betweenness will inform her analytical perspective on the turbulences in the politics of gender in Europe we are going to discuss. Finally, I would like to introduce to you my 2 dear German colleagues. First of all, Anika Keinz studied European ethnology at the Humboldt University and was junior professor of comparative social and cultural anthropology at the European University Viadrina, Frankfurt Oder. She taught transdisciplinary gender and queer studies. We invited her to the panel discussion this evening because of her central research focus on gender politics in Poland against the background of the ongoing and highly uneven processes of Europeanization. She got very close to the feminist movements in Poland for her PhD project, and she warned very early against a simple interpretation of gender discourses in politics from a Western perspective. Rather, she showed very early that gender equality and LGBT rights discourses were used within the dominant Europeanization matrix as yardstick to qualify actors in politics along the West-East modernity backwardness poles. And I learned quite a lot from Anika in this respect. As Poland is still Europe's naughty government, probably together with Hungary, they are seemingly competing, against whom the EU took legal action in front of the European Court for Justice only recently, we are very excited to hear how Anika will contextualize, explain these developments with a view on Poland and the relation to the EU and Germany. And lastly, I would like to introduce to you my dear colleague and co-convener for years of our Committee on Gender Studies, Beate Binder. Beate holds the only professorship for gender studies in European ethnology in our discipline at the Humboldt University. We invited her to our evening roundtable discussion, not only because Beate is probably one of the most active person in our gender committee with the longest history there. And she has been its co-convener for I don't know how many years. Additionally, she is active in the nationwide Fachgesellschaft Gender Studies and as such deeply involved in the current debates on anti-genderism and the denunciation of gender as an orderly science. But we invited her to our evening roundtable because, and also in her capacity as the only gender professor with a broad expertise in the history of feminist cultural anthropology, as well as a research focus on the anthropology of politics and legal anthropology. And her recent research project were especially focusing on law and legal matters, pointing to the fact that there are lots of paradoxes in the developments in this field in the last years, and raising the question why and what it brings with it if we also as feminists play the card of law and the framing things in a legal way. So I'm very interested also to listen to your input. But Andrea, please start. But before you start, please, I always forget to say some words where I am. So I'm Sabine Hess. I'm professor here at Göttingen at the Institute for Cultural Anthropology. And I suppose what qualifies me to moderate the discussion is, on the one hand, that I'm co-convening this committee, this gender committee, and on the other hand, my research focus on gender and migration with a view on the southeast of Europe. And I would have really loved you all to invite to Göttingen and to our campus, but now I'm also quite happy that we did this conference, at least via this kind of Zoom way. And one last remark before we start, please write your questions in the chat function and please use the mode. So you will see two modes. There's one mode addressing the question just to us as the discussants, and another mode where also the rest of the audience can see your question. Please use this mode so that everybody can follow also the chat and the questions in the chat. After 2 rounds here, we will open the discussion to everybody, and then you can also use the hand function, the hand symbol, indicating that you want to put a question forward. Now, Andrea, it's the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Congratulations to this fantastic event, Sabine and Beate. I really enjoyed yesterday, for example, Paula Villa's fantastic keynote speech, and I'm an honor. It's an honor for me to be on the same panel with Madina, Betül, Anika, and of course Beate. So we were given a very difficult task and questions before the event. So the first possibility to respond to the questions is 6 minutes. So I wrote this up, so I will read it. And in the second round, we have got 3 minutes. So I also wrote this up to make sure I'm keeping the time. So when I was still living in Budapest, in one morning, I went to buy my fresh bed rolls in the local bakery when one day, two construction workers were having their breakfast. By waiting for my turn, I had to listen to their conversation, which was, for my greatest surprise, about nothing else than the different definitions of gender. This is what Eric Fassin calls paradoxical recognition of a discipline. Gender studies scholars recently cannot complain about lack of wider social interest in their work. Gender studies faculty members' mailboxes have been filled with emails with inquiry about their research, invitation to public debates by different media outlets. At the same time, we are also targeted by online public harassment, found ourselves listed by name as enemies of the nation on front pages of national newspapers, aiming to silence and humiliate academics. This new systematic and systemic attack on gender studies is a part of the anti-gender campaigns. This anti-gender movement stands as a nationalist, neoconservative response to the triple crisis, migration, financial, and security crisis, induced by the global neoliberal world order, which uses gender as symbolic glue to create alliances with hate and exclusion to redefine what normal is, creating livable, desirable alternative to liberal democracy. The anti-gender movements, while attacking gender studies as an academic discipline, are gaining much support all over Europe. For example, recently in Denmark, the Danish People's Party demanded closing down the gender studies programs. So what can we learn from this so-called paradoxical recognition of gender studies? What are the consequences? It is not a surprise that the lessons learned are also paradoxical. First, I've got four. First, public education, previously thought to be a safe haven for academic freedom versus private universities, which were more open for neoliberalization. By now, the tide has changed. The states are captured and private universities might enjoy more relative academic freedom. Students at public universities are also not always the best friends of gender studies scholars, and they are reporting, complaining, and harassing scholars at public universities. Second, yet, due to the anti-gender campaigns, gender studies knowledge and production has changed forever. Gender studies became a pop science. Not only that politicians and public intellectuals without any knowledge or training in gender studies are making unquestionable public statements in professional issues as sex education or science curriculum. As Sarah Garbagnoli pointed out, the books of Judith Butler and other gender studies scholars now are shelved in bookshops together with anti-gender volumes as if they had the same scientific weight. But this is happening paradoxically when there is a resurgence of credibility of science and the experts as a result of pandemic, and also as an attempt of the illiberal state officials in their fight against gender studies when they are applying the toolkit of science, citing hodgepodge surveys in an ad hoc manner, allowing them to undermine the relevance of gender research, empirical findings, as well as the value and the legitimacy of the scientific endeavor in general. But the major challenge is what happened with academic authorization. Parallel systems of academic authorization have been developed by illiberal states. The illiberal states are systematically destroying the existing mechanisms of scientific evaluation, turning these institutions into performing formalities, rendering them mere simulacra of the original institutions. By these illiberal states hacked quality assurance via accreditation committees, it also mimics the neoliberalized scientific evaluation system of indices and excellence. An example, due to the recent modification of the collection of Hungarian scientific works, where all Hungarian academics must upload their works along with citations, publication in a Q1 journal is only worth as much as a publication in any of the Hungarian scientific journals. The same happening in Poland. During the recent modification of the evaluation system, international peer-reviewed English language journals were replaced by the local Polish journals whose profiles and of course editorial boards are pro-government. During hacking of the academic quality assurance system, the previous consensus on publishing in English in scientific journals has been questioned, signaling a change in scientific orientation. Instead of the global north, it now rather tends to the east, to Russia and China. For gender studies, where the Holy Grail had been being published in Science or Feminist Theory or the European Journal of Feminist Studies, all those achievements suddenly disappear. What are the consequences? I'll tell you in the second round. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this picture, drawing this picture, which is even more gloomy somehow. Betül, please, it's yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really honored and happy to be here with all these excellent speakers and the audience, large, very large, inclusive audience. So I will do the other way around. I will start with a brief explanation where I'm standing on, and then in the second round, I will explore more on my concepts and general theoretical framework that I'm departing from. So, and I will use PowerPoint, although I don't like it, but I think it's convenient to be more clear in very short time, and time management is also important, but I'm not able to. Am I? No.
Yeah, yes, you should be able to.
Okay, that's great. So, yeah, as Sabine has mentioned, I have worked on neoliberal, neoconservative body politics of the presently governing party, AKP. It has been governing for a very long time, for the last few decades. And amazingly, it has, I mean, in the case of Turkey, I think it's very unique that we see the same party governing in different periods, drifting in the process of drifting the political ground towards authoritarianism or illiberalism. So this is something very unique, I would say. But yeah, this party has very sui generis gender politics as well. That's my focus in general. And I will start with exploring what kind of theoretical framework I am exploring. What is my main question and main problematic in that sense? And for many feminist scholars and activists, the recent authoritarian drifts in political grounds of European countries, including Turkey, and severe attacks against women's rights are a matter of an increase in the capitalist oppression and the routine manifestations of patriarchy and authoritarian male power in societies. Perceiving a kind of continuity in history, most of the time these analyses give no explicit account of why and how there has been such an increase, or if it is only a matter of increase in the level of oppressiveness of capitalist states and patriarchal systems. As opposed to this perspective, or different from this perspective, Grzebalska, Kovács, and Pető talk about the crisis of neoliberal democracies and revival of conservative anti-modernist forces and forms in the name of rebuilding social unity and order. Denis Candioti talks about the crisis of classical patriarchy, which coincides with a profound crisis of masculinity. She considers the present process as a process of masculinist restoration. On the other hand, Wendy Brown emphasizes not only the shifts and crises, but also continuities, as she states, the emergence of new and destructive forces has a deep connection with long-lasting hegemony of neoliberal rationality in governance, or as a mode of governance, which has not only resulted in neoconservative gender subjectivities ranging from neoconservative feminisms to toxic masculinities, but also institutional forms that would ascribe wider legitimacy to recent radical right-wing forces. In line with these arguments, I will follow a conjunctural analysis. I followed in my analysis in general, a conjunctural perspective that press upon embeddedness of such phenomena in tension of historical change, crisis, stability, instability, struggle at local and global levels by using a whole and masses approach. I make use of analysis emphasize all discontinuities like Andrea Petty and Candioti and others, together with the analysis stress upon continuities like Wendy Brown, and I follow analysis that focus not only on structural, institutional, and oppressive aspect of the power, but also subjective, constitutive impacts of power and power struggles in political context of Turkey. So at this point, I ask how the AKP, that's the ruling party, has responded to the crisis of neoliberal democracy and classical patriarchy in the late 2000s, and how it has drifted from neoliberal democratic to an illiberal democratic position, from neoliberal gender equality to neoconservative gender or sex justice discourse. The Turkish version of this drift can be also followed in the AKP's changing discourse or the changing project of conservative democracy to one nation, one state, and one flag discourse or project. And provocatively, I prefer to use concepts like neoliberal feminism and neoconservative feminism to understand this shift, this discursive process of changes, but I will explore on this in the second round more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betül, for this analytical insights, really inspiring. I would now like ask Madina to...
Thank you. Thank you, Sabine. Okay, I will try to be as short as possible. Well, as we already heard in the first wonderful presentations, indeed it has become commonplace to critique the proliferation of the right nationalist and authoritarian sentiments in contemporary politics and social life. And Europe is not the only and not maybe even the most illustrative example of this tendency. As we know, gender politics and the attitude to gender studies are used as a very clear example of this global reaction. However, in my view, we need to differentiate between very different and often contradictory political agendas and group interests that stand behind these attacks on gender, sexual, religious, and racial diversity and equality that are typical for today's paradoxical moment in the evolvement of the global coloniality, a moment in which the former political antipodes such as left and right, nationalism and cosmopolitanism, conservatism and radicalism are clearly questioned, undone, and become increasingly interchangeable. Moreover, I think that we also need to be able to see that the alt-right and populist turn is just an indication of a larger, longer, and deeper tendencies, which cannot be easily simplified into some familiar formula that first we had some democracy and liberalism as the best of possible models, and then came the bad populists, traditionalists, nationalists, racists, and misogynists, and whoever, and ruined this ideal. Because this simplified understanding is very nearsighted, of course, and attempts to cure the disease with the very means that originally caused it, ignoring the complex, long-going crisis of the so-called European values and the erosion of its presumable unity. And behind it all stands a chronic tendency to this kind of sense of exceptionalism, of self-complacency, and the general disregard of the underside of modernity. So we were asked to reflect on this unfortunate situation against the background of our geographical positioning and disciplinary approaches. The first claim is hardly possible for me to fulfill because I have lived in Sweden since 2015, but I'm not Swedish, I'm not European, and hardly have any rights to discuss that specific space, I guess, as an insider. So I could only speak as an outsider, as an other living there in Europe, an out-of-place professor of post-colonial feminisms in a country that does not really see the importance of relevance of this particular type of gender studies, and therefore places me automatically into some ghettoized marginal space, vaguely interesting and vaguely intersecting maybe with the painful and contested migration problem that is very painful in Sweden recently, right? So feminism and gender studies used to be very much white, Eurocentric and mainstream in Sweden by default, and mostly dealing with the issues of policies. This is the main framework. Whereas all other aspects of gender studies have been neglected because it was and often still is assumed that post-colonial or much less decolonial feminism that I do is a problem of some kind of far away, exotic and dangerous places where Sweden can play a noble role of the white savior, or these aspects of feminism were depoliticized and appropriated to bring somehow new blood and new ideas to the exhausted and disintegrating European feminism. So racial and religious discrimination and related anti-immigrant mood are still relatively new topics in Sweden when it comes to internal analysis. And it is very hard for the audience to actually accommodate these elements into the local intersectional cocktail, where class is still much more important than race, and gender exists separately from race, religion, or ethnicity. At the same time, in the last several years, Sweden has lost its previous image of the country of gender equality and winning feminist agenda. And there are many examples. I will just give you two short ones. It's the closing down of the Gender Equality Agency and numerous public discussions on the necessity of closing down gender studies departments, as well as Andrea mentioned already in Denmark, and cutting the financing of gender research as useless and expensive for the state, up to the cases of open violence, hate speech, and hate crimes, such as a relatively recent fake bomb that was left outside the office of the Swedish Secretariat for Gender Research in Gothenburg. So these are the very acts of violence and hate speech testify to the fact that gender question cannot be solved once and for all and closed, as a Swedish alt-right and populist hypocrisy preach. And the moment it is considered unimportant, destabilizing national stability, or expensive for taxpayers, it brings on a revival of these kind of xenophobic sentiments, which we can witness today. And generally, this right-wing fundamentalists taken over in many parts of the world are in some ways a cosmological result of the fall of the state socialist system and the short-lived neoliberal claims of owing the world. If the Cold War logic allowed the state socialist system to act as a counterbalance for the capitalist world and thus gave some opportunities to the people to fight for their rights, today this function is performed by completely different institutions such as nationalist, religious, populist, protectionist, and other such local forms, which act as a steam release, creating an illusion of change. So we are living in a moment when the optimistic neoliberal global chant of the shrunken world of happy consumers, erased borders is actually over, and the COVID crisis ended it completely, of course. And the movement of capital and goods and few globetrotters is no longer there. Instead of that, we see a complex refugee crisis. We see the world that is not actually living up to this fantasy. So the neoliberal global model manifests the same old darker colonial sides and sometimes in new wrappings, and causes the revival of this kind of stale geopolitics and the defensive strengthening of nation states with overt top-down nationalist agendas and new imperial agendas that we see in many countries in Europe as well. And as I said, the COVID crisis finally brings this globalization chant to an end, at least in its neoliberal form. And at the same time, it makes yesterday's populist agenda very much vulnerable as well, for it's becoming clear now that nationalists and populists have the point, but do not have a solution. And here I'm quoting Ivan Krastev. So the pandemic, in this sense, has only accelerated the already obvious contradictions in the way governments, unions, people, try to reconcile these empty signifiers of democracy, of authoritarianism, free trade, economic protectionism, and so on. Yet, and I'm almost finishing, from a decolonial viewpoint, the shift from neoliberal globalism to this right-wing nationalism is not actually that important, because it essentially leaves the colonial matrix of power intact. The disillusionment in the failed globalization promise is manipulated by the weakened nation states and regrouping geopolitical unions and powers wishing to regain their control and divert the public attention from real problems to these highly politicized and excessively emotional constructed issues so typical of this post-truth reality that we live in. So this reaction indicates a systemic crisis and possibly the beginning of the end of neoliberalism, at least I hope so, as the only remaining model of modernity that was imposed on us, or perhaps even an ultimate discrediting of the project of modernity / coloniality as such. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Madina, for bringing in the post-colonial or the coloniality, the general structure of coloniality to our discussion. And now, Anika, I would like you to go on.
Thank you, Sabine. Thank you very much for the invitation to this roundtable. I feel very honored and I must say very anxious and excited to be here with such distinguished scholars, and my anxiety even grew, Sabine, because I'm afraid I will disappoint you. I will not talk about Poland because I can only observe the developments and dynamics in Poland from afar since a few years. And as you know, I'm not in academia anymore, but still I'm very interested in Poland, and that's why I attended the panel in this morning. And Paweł Lewicki and others, my colleague Bożena Hołownia from Frankfurt Oder University and Agnieszka Koszczanska from Warsaw University, they all do great research, as you probably know. So, but what I learned while being in Poland and afterwards is to take a critical look back to Germany, not only to complicate the East-West dichotomy, and that is so prominent in politics, in the European Union and in media, of course, all the time, but to observe what I called a few years ago with Cassin and Scott in mind, the fantasy of sexular democracy, sexular being a combination of sexual and secular. So I will not really go into this very much, but I will make broad brushes about this, some of the developments I observed. Also thinking about the phrase shrinking democratic spaces that was in the description of the roundtable. And I wasn't sure if I would agree on that, but I thought about the harsh debates, the aggression, the hostility, even more personal hostility we read and we experience around gender. So let me give you some of my observations, and probably most of that you know, particularly those based in Germany, but maybe for others it's interesting. So in Germany, misogyny and anti-genderism, and we heard yesterday a lot about it, combined with racism and nationalism, are increasingly public and outspoken, I think, for quite some time now. And talk of so-called genderism, racist and homophobic statements, the racialization of homophobia, and the racialization of tolerance and freedom, white, have simultaneously emerged, I think, already 20 years ago, and then increasingly onwards. So these, what Butler calls progressive freedoms, and what I call sexual democracy, and the tolerant handling of sexual minorities and the increased promotion of gender equality and emancipatory values have, as you all probably observed, become central features of European Union, European or Western identities and democracies, respectively. So these emancipatory ethical and political values and sexist and misogynist attitudes were increasingly transformed into inherent personal attributes of particular members of particular national or regional collectivities. I'm not going into detail because I think you all can sort of map who is attributed with these attitudes. So against this background, and also when thinking about the research in the panel I attended this morning, I think we need to carefully differentiate the various contexts and spheres where gender and sexual issues or gendered issues are addressed and debated or researched, be it politics, law and policies, the public sphere, the media, international relations, Europeanization, and of course, everyday life. And more so where gender is and remains absent. But structures, perceptions, promotions, feelings, and careers. And I'm increasingly interested in scholarly experiences and biographies and how gender, among other categories, structures academia and how gender is seen and debated within universities. And I think there is a huge problem as well. At least from my experience, not so much personal, but what I experienced, how things were discussed, how it is talked about people behind doors, how you are dismissed if somebody introduces you like, oh, this is my colleague Anika, she's doing gender. So I found it interesting to see from about 2001 onwards how sexual politics have increasingly become imbued with time, drawing temporal and spatial borders, constituting the modern state and the modern subject as progressive, liberal, secular, and emancipated. And at the same time, observing fierce anti-genderism combined with racism and nationalism, etc. So more or less for the past 18 years, I observed that the language of equality and values such as dignity, freedom, equality, citizens' rights, and justice, which form the foundation of the European Union, have been increasingly deployed by various social and political actors. And it doesn't matter, be they left, right-wing, right populist, right conservative, secular, or religious. My observation, though, is that the content in terms of whose dignity should be protected, which freedoms are relevant to whom, who is considered equal, whom the concept of equality should include, and who is a citizen endowed with all social, civil, and political rights differs enormously in these different groups. So the content and meaning of values such as equality or dignity or freedom and justice are sometimes interpreted through the lens of science, that could be medicine or biology or psychology, but psychology often is seen as a social science, and sometimes through the lens of law and the language of human rights linked to moral philosophical perspectives, and other times through science, social science or Islam or religious studies. I mean, particularly if you think who is called upon to explain gender issues, and then it depends on the expert and the expertise, what he or she makes sense of. So for example, Paula Villa gave us a nice overview yesterday over the various strands in the rhetoric of anti-genderism. So I would say conservative and traditional positions quite accept equality in difference in Germany. They even promote equality, but emphasize the different social roles of men and women in society and family, and root them firmly in biology and the binary gender system. And the same way they promote the right to cultural difference, exactly the same, and identity and national preference. So these positions are firmly based on the view that essential differences distinguish women from men, as well as natives and non-natives. So we can clearly analyze that these differences are explained in terms both of nature and culture, and each seen as forming a distinct entity and an essence. In their perspective, of course, not in mine. Since decades, we observe that when it comes to women and men, it is reproduction, pregnancy, motherhood, and child rearing, which are seen as essential, and that still is largely so. And here's a fun fact. any debates that figure reproduction and child rearing as liability is seen as either anti-women or paradoxically as anti-gender, but not in the sense of anti-genderism. So all this is not new, and Paula Villa showed yesterday evening how gender has become a buzzword and a trigger. It more often than not is perceived as a threat to society, to the family, and particularly to men, it seems. We should definitely be aware of these processes, but we should not lose sight of the developments from a historical perspective and from an empirical perspective. Of course, I'm talking as an anthropologist. So when it comes to rightward swings on the one hand and the turn to sexual or sexular democracy on the other, one approach is the anthropological classic. Follow the native's point of view by trying, in quote native, by trying to understand the views of those engaged in these movements and those who feel threatened. Go out and talk to different people, to movement leaders and supporters in order to find out who they are, how they live, and what motivates them. And second, pay attention to the rhetoric through which the politicians, journalists, activists, and scholars construct their world. Paula Villa listed yesterday some examples of the used rhetoric. And I think this is a really important way to analyze the different understanding of gender and to identify when it is not about gender. So personally, and that's just a few more sentences, I'm curious, or I would be very curious about an interdisciplinary study carried out by anthropologists, psychologists, and historians and sociologists, of course, all trained in gender studies and based in ethnography, life stories and storytelling, expert knowledge and archival material. And this material would be, of course, ideally analyzed through a queer feminist perspective. I wonder if such a study could tell us something about the fears, the myths, and the needs of individuals and groups regarding gender, but also to which values gender is linked, thinking of democracy, etc. And how the term democracy and is linked to gender and used and understood by women and men and non-binary persons, trans people, Black and people of color, homosexuals, migrants, non-status persons in Germany, in Poland, in Hungary, in Russia, the States, told through their life stories. So what are people's stories, hopes, and expectations? Thank you.
It's not an easy task to moderate you all because you make up such a big picture every time and having such big questions or you know, putting forward. So Beate, unfortunately now it's your job, or you are in the row with your presentation. And
yes, but maybe we make such big answers because your questions were as big as our answers are supposed to be, as when we get such questions, I think. Okay, it was only this morning that I read in the Berlin newspaper a little comment of Livio Mattei, the chancellor of the CIU in Vienna. And he said, responding to the current attacks of the Minister of Education in France against the Islamo-Gauchism of the universities, that there is intermingling Islamic and leftist ideologies, and we have to free universities from this thinking or the way of thinking. So he was very much concerned about this process, and at the same time said that there is no legal, that the problem is that academic freedom is a term which is undefined in legal respects. So what he says, what we have the problem at the moment is that we can't refer to something, at least on the European level, what is legal, academic freedom means in legal terms. Given my background, as you've heard, I'm based at Humboldt University and do research at the intersection of policies, law, and moral from an anthropological perspective, and at the crossroads to feminist queer studies. I would like to add some thoughts on the contradictory role of law in the current situation. And I think this intervention of Livio Mattei is a very interesting example of how it works, or how the thinking works in a way. Rather short, of course, and it's more to bring our attention to law, not only as something framing current politics and practices, but is as itself being an important and contradictory player in the current constellation or conjuncture. However, what strikes me most are the discrepancies and paradoxes the role of law plays in the contemporary conjuncture. I think we should understand better the dynamics of legal strategies and the double impact law has as being enabling and allowing something and restricting and excluding at the same time. And it does it always, even the best law does it, is my point of view. My thoughts are influenced by Wendy Brown on the one side, that is a theoretical discussion about rights and the notion of having rights, and an ethnographic approach to law on the other side, which follows law in the everyday and investigates the social life of law, or as Mariana Valverde put it, the legal complex, as something which is really like constructed out of everyday practices, as well, of course, as of other components and institutions and stuff. I'm very much going with Wendy Brown's considerations in her famous text, Suffering the Paradoxes of Rights. In German, the title is even better. It's like Das Recht, kein Recht zu haben, or something like this. It's playing a lot more with this. And as well, her article on finding the man behind the state. Given the precarious and endangered conditions of women's and minorities situation in a world ordered by sexual exploitation, Brown's argument goes, rights appear as that what we cannot not want. However, the paradox of right is that it opens up possibilities and at the same time regulates and restricts possible pathways to a more just, a real just world. This even more so as laws, and this is true even more so for human rights, are based on individual freedom and rights, at least in our context we are talking about, and thus on the figure of the bourgeois, mostly male and individual. Even though legal scholars think about a post-categorical law, at the moment law works as categorization machine and produces categories we have to relate ourselves to. We are in a highly contradictory moment. On the one hand, we have a proliferation of the human rights discourse, and of course, with possibilities in it to relate to legal regulations and to fight for our own rights, and we can relate to these human rights and all what is anti-discrimination laws and stuff. And we have the restrictive politics that hinders the implementation. The Istanbul Convention, for example, or such conventions are ratified, and it took decades till they are implemented in national law, and even more important, in bureaucratic procedures. We have followed up this, for example, with the UN Disability Rights Convention, which is now slowly going into something which is really working for everyday lives. And it's the same with the Istanbul Convention and the gender-based and sexualized violence. It will fight, but it isn't really working till today on a everyday level in a way. It's like something in the air. On the other hand, and at some points closely entangled, we have a growing impact of a politics of criminalization. Again, state-based as well as in the form of claims coming from below. And we are part of this politics of criminalization in certain respects, not all, but at certain. So I think we have to think more thoroughly about all these dynamics and this contradictory role the law plays. And we have to think about what impact the juridification or the proliferation of rights discourses and rights practices and the politics of referring to right, not to the right, but to law, better to say, what this impact, what this juridification, how it impacts in different contexts. That is the growing impact the reference to law has, the wish to clear things by legislation or to shift argumentation to the court, which is a real problem, I think, because as some scholars have shown, it makes invisible social and class-based injustices and other things, because it's this law works in a certain way. And last not least, we see as well the instrumentalization of rights connected to gender and sexuality, or of gender-based and sexualized violence for national, chauvinist and gender traditional up to anti-gender politics. That was a strange sentence, but what I wanted to say is that it's of course part of this homonormative and homonationalist politics. There is playing rights and the reference to rights as well an important role. Okay, I think this is even more interesting for us to have a closer look at these processes, as I know, working closely together with legal scholars, that anthropological knowledge plays an important role in the legal processes we have there. They refer in parts to knowledge we as anthropologists have produced, but we consider today as highly problematic. And they make use of people or referring to work which is based on a highly essentialized notions of culture or of human beings as such or something. So as well, I think we have to show more clearly what our way of considering these problems is to them. I mean, to them in the sense of legal scholars, and to go into discussions with them. And I stop here for the first round.
Thank you very much, Beate, to expand our view and specifically also address the developments on the legal field, or questioning the processes of juridification and the politics of law, perhaps, or especially the politics of criminalization as well. I feel now a little bit bad to stop the discussion here, because in fact there's so much food for thought and already somehow controversial, or points which would be interesting to further debate. But still, I would like to ask you at least to have, like, very shortly address our second question, which we wanted, or which we posed to you. The second question where we wanted to discuss what all this, your analysis means for gender studies. How should gender studies react, and how should we, or do we have to reconsider our core analytical paradigms and approaches? And I definitely, I think this would be also very, very, interesting to know what you think about that. So please, Andrea.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So my 3 minutes. What can all those gender studies scholars do when their field work and their publications are labeled not only worthless and useless, but they cannot emigrate to an international academic space, which has its own problem too? And I'm suggesting 3 strategies there. One is the new survival strategies, new collaborations, and new measurements. as the road towards gender studies is blocked, the study of family policy as a scientific endeavor has been established. Many have been seemingly surfaced as experts in family policy or family studies. This follows the Russian example, how gender studies programs are becoming family studies programs. This strategy of adaptation is well known to middle-aged intellectuals from the communist era. One may pursue a career and publish if one is not openly against the regime. For example, the Center for Family Studies in the Institute of Sociology, established in 2020, whose existence is not clear from the English version of the institutional website. Instead, family and gender stream is on the website. The Corvinus University of Economics and Business, one of the first privatized institutions, was formerly a gender studies pioneer through the work of its sociology department. The very first gender studies center was organized there, and the stream of gender-sensitive young political and social scientists graduated there. A new English language, MA Economics of Family Policy and Public Policies for Human Development, has now been established there as a part of the government's family mainstreaming concept, with the contribution of the most well-known feminist gender experts. In Poland, however, women's studies and research on women have experienced a new revival, not without a theoretical and political risk. But the institutional and academic vulnerability of gender studies is increasing because of this re-evaluation of its position in the field of science as such. Government propaganda has deliberately undermined the social and symbolic legitimation of gender studies, and this has only exacerbated the panic and bitterness felt among those involved, sparkling additional horrendous Facebook debates. Debates between feminist scholars had intensified, copying the style and tone very often of the attacks of the liberal state, internalizing the tone, and it became ruthless. And instead of debates, we see attacks. So what are the new collaborations? During these years, new insights had been gained, bridging previously cleavages thought to be theoretically unbridgeable, such as collaboration between secular and religious political forces turned to be the most promising. It is unusual that practice is much ahead of theory in case of gender studies, but the swift and unexpected developments due to the anti-gender movements brought unexpected results in developing intersectional and transversal theory. New measurement. The United European Scientific Evaluation System has failed to meet the challenges posed by illiberal states. This is clearly illustrated by the fact that the Hungarian Accreditation Committee obtained its European license only after CEU was forced into exile and the 2-year master's program in gender studies was stricken from the accredited study list. The European scientific infrastructure was unprepared for the emergence of these institutions, which they look like scientific institutions, but they do not act as scientific institutions. These illiberal institutions use the neoliberal language of excellence, competitiveness, impact, social outreach, and indices. However, they are all fraudulent. According to the recent report by Scholars at Risk, I quote, academic freedom is not acknowledged in any of the influential university rankings. As a reference point for scholars, university administrators and governments data sets such as Shanghai ranking and the Higher Education World University ranking, the QS World University ranking, or the U multi-rank are in a unique position to improve academic freedom by altering incentive structures for students, scholars, universities, and governments, end quote. This proposal to include into this very controversial ranking system academic freedom seemed to be the only solution, which is also a problem. Gender studies found itself in this paradoxical recognition with the help of the attacks by the illiberal forces. Time will show if reactivity can be transformed to activity for the sake of a better future for all. Thank you.
Betül, do you want to go on?
So yeah, I will go on with my analysis. As I told you before, I specifically use concepts like neoliberal feminism, neoconservative feminism to explore and understand the dynamic and contradictory character of the recent anti-gender politics. And as I said, the field, I mean, the social process or political process of change that has been occurring for the last 2 decades is more, should be captured in more dynamic way than many analyses we propose. There has been discontinuities together with continuities. We have to consider the power relations, not in terms of oppressiveness of the power, but also constitutive effects of the power. For all these reasons, I decided to capture a word, a concept of neoliberal feminism and neoconservative feminism to understand rather contradictory inside of the recent Islamic conservative government's politics. So this might sound very awkward. It's on open. My concepts are open to be debated, but I like to share why I choose this path. In the context of Turkey in the early 2000s, neoliberal feminism has emerged as a new subject position. That's what I argue. And a discourse which plays an important role in cementing, or in Pető's and others' terminology using, gluing the earlier liberal power bloc and social consensus that has also been built by the AKP under the leadership of Erdogan. We all know what neoliberal feminism is, I suppose, but in the context of Turkey, it's also very, there are some similarities and dissimilarities in reference to general literature on neoliberalism. And in the context of Turkey, it works a little very complex patchwork of different narratives, ranging from Westernism to Islamism, feminism, and liberalism. And it calls the women, gendered subjects, into active economic subjects, and rather than not only emphasizing on the issue of curtailing the social state, but also it calls the subjects to empower themselves in more marketized terms. So it's not only oppressive, as I said, it's more also very constitutive in a way, the neoliberal feminism in some sense. So it calls not only secular subjects, secular women, but also religious women as well. So this empowerment works, as Rothenberg underlines, neoliberal feminism, individuated and economized female subject, is feminist to the extent that she is distinctively aware of current inequalities between the men and women, yet simultaneously neoliberal as she disavows or ignores the social, cultural, economic forces producing this inequality. It's very much worked on the notion of crafting the work and family balance in the name of participation of women in the labor power. So the similar pattern we can follow in the Turkish context. And in the AKP discourse. And what we see also promotion of neoliberal subjects in very liberal feminist terms and in respect to women's rights issues, with the burden of the EU-led democratization process. That was the early 2000 period. But now we have come to another period, and as the failure of neoliberal democracy and liberal women's rights perspective has also failed, I would say. However, it's not only the failure of the women's rights perspective in liberal terms, but also within the neoliberal framework, of course. But it has had some contradictory impacts on the subject positions of women in both secular and Islamic sectors of society in Turkey. I mean, on the one hand, women, even though they have conservative values, mobilized by the neoliberal feminism of the AKP in the early periods of the 2000s. So the participation of women in the public sphere has tremendously increased, although there were structural limitations to transform this mobilization into a more equal or more just forms of participation and the use of public, but still they were there as a capacity, as an energy in the public sphere. However, AKP, on the one hand, deal with the crisis of classical patriarchal crisis that has been more obvious after the neoliberal right concepts attacks. But on the other hand, they managed to rebuild the notion of women's rights in their own discourse. At the beginning, they have developed lots of liberal reforms, but in the second period, I would argue, it was not only it's not only a simple backlash in the form of governing, but rebuild and reform whole the public sphere on their own gendered terms in a way. So I will focus briefly on the second period of the AKP, and then finally come to the conclusion of what I mean by neoconservative feminism. What we see in the second round, towards the end of the 2000s, under the impact of global crisis and with the dismantlement of the earlier liberal power bloc towards the end of 2000s, the AKP and President Erdogan have made a new maneuver towards an authoritarian and illiberal position. This shift has been succeeded in parallel with changes in gender institutional strategies and discourses of the party that I frame with the concept of neoconservative feminism. The latter emerged in a very destructive and oppositional manner against secular, queer, and feminist politics and earlier liberal politics of gender equality in Turkey. This new political discourse was based on what Candioti calls a politics of resentment, encourages the projection of hatred on groups or communities seen as either privileged and exclusionary or as potentially treasonous. As Brown underlines, long-lasting hegemony of neoliberal rationality has not only deepened existing social political problems, but also provided legitimacy and room for radical right-wing groups and ideas which would feed conservative views and toxic masculinities and became the basis of illiberal democracies. However, in this later period, the AKP began to appeal to resentment felt by these radical groups who were badly affected by the earlier dominant neoliberal policies and who demanded for a conservative masculinist restoration of society. Hence, being ruled under centralized state power and masculine authorities in a new patriarchal order has become the political trajectory of the government. All these were signs of an end of politics of non-defiance, which I used to define the early period of the AKP. Its replacement with the aggressive use of conservative values concerning moral order and security. This return to the politics of defiance can be followed in various policies, which I will not go into detail, but you can see in the picture, in the PowerPoint that I share in my screen. But rather, instead of this, I will just mention about conceptual shifts that we can follow in the discourse of politicians. For instance, I mean, it's not simple demolishment of the right discourse. It's the replacement of all these discursive concepts that are produced by earlier neoliberal discourses. I would say. So instead of just appropriating the old liberal feminist concepts, they are transforming them now in the second round. For instance, instead of women's right to choose in the abortion debate, they emphasize on the right of fetus to live, for instance. As an alternative to the concept of equality they developed, and they developed the concept of justice, or gender justice at the beginning. Nowadays, they start using sex justice instead. And this has always been used in parallel with the concept of equal opportunities, which sounds very neoliberal at the same time. In respect to the debates on the cancellation of Istanbul Agreement, the AKP, which has been growing debate in the recent few weeks in Turkey, as well as in other parts of the world, the AKP politicians and pro-AKP journalists defended the rights of men. So they don't exclude the notion of rights, they still refer to the concept of rights, but in a new framework, and blame feminists for being sexist in the sense of being only on the side of women and not considering the rights of others like child rights and men's rights. For them, Istanbul Agreement is forced over Turkey by the Western power groups with the aim of dismantling family life and national unity. In all these moralizing discourses of Erdogan and others, the conservative female body has been transformed not only into borders drawn between us and them, but also as a means to moralize crisis, which Turkey was going through. In most of the statements, politicians were making, one could see how definition of what are considered as threats to the nation state are filtered through gendered and sexualized anxieties about national virility, sovereignty, and integrity. So I like to conclude within this context. I mean, this is very slippery context that we are talking about, as has been referred in respect to the concept of gender. But I believe that this complexity requires more intuitive and complex conceptual framework as well, to be able to catch also the slippery floor that feminism is going through. And I believe that instead of some reactionary and oppositional position, which diminishes the existing discourse of power groups to irrational and pathological discourses coming from Islamic sectors of society, I believe, as following Pető's, for instance, argument, that I believe we should consider them creating a new mode of governments and new mode of rationality, which has some connotation or interaction with even liberal feminism in some ways. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Betül, to open up the analytical debate. I mean, we are now debating on different levels. I mean, Andrea Petty is clearly indicating that we already, or not we, agree, but you are already confronted with very, very material effects which have already started to change the university system very, very deeply. On the other hand, we are still discussing about if it's contradictory or if there are continuities and not. So I have the feelings that within Europe, we have already started to feel the effects or to be on quite different levels affected and affected by the phenomenon we are talking about. Madina, so I'm very curious to know where you start to address the problem.
Thank you, Sabine. It's difficult to say what I think in 3 minutes, but I will try. Well, first of all, defending any kind of studies or any kind of discipline is against the decolonial thinking, because from long ago we started writing that we don't believe in disciplines, because disciplines are part of this global modernity coloniality and the way we are kind of, the way of thinking that is imposed on us. So defending gender studies is not an end in itself, but at the same time, gender studies at their best, I think, should be a place for radical critical thinking, which is crucial in any democratic society. Unfortunately, it is easier to do this being legitimized as studies, to be called studies, to be called a discipline. Then you can be better off in the neoliberal university. But it comes with a very high price of rigidity, of increasing detachment from the social world, the necessity of complying with the larger modern colonial frames of knowledge production and distribution. And what I find particularly problematic in gender studies, and maybe particularly in Europe, is their mismatch within itself, a certain loss of their collective goal that we would all share. Partly it's connected with the illusion that I mentioned before, that in Europe, in contrast with these other exotic, dangerous places, all gender equality questions are long solved, and therefore gender researchers can either turn their attention to some fine-tuning the issues of policies and laws within specific nation states, usually interpreted in a quite empirical way. At least this is what I see here in Sweden. And this, of course, leads to that people completely ignore the arrays of problems that do not fit this prescribed understanding of gender studies, or, which is maybe even more alarming, we safely move to more fashionable topics, hip, I would say even, fashionable topics of the privileged people, such as a feminist new materialism, which is, again, very much popular in Sweden. Or finally, what I find also very problematic, it has them to prove their own necessity for the society in some highly concrete and utilitarian way. So when we are attacked, the response of many of my colleagues is that let's show to the society that we're actually useful, not attempting to raise the public awareness in relation to serious ethical issues, political issues, but this public is perhaps unable to understand and grasp, but on the contrary, descending themselves to this very mediocre level to satisfy this public's expectations in order to beg for grants, state support, and all that. Hence, the pathetic public outreach events and initiatives aimed at convincing that gender studies are actually able to earn their daily bread, that we are not, eating this bread for free. In extreme cases of neoliberal academia, we face a rapid decrease in academic freedom due to the fact that critical, politically engaged, and not instrumentally applicable, let's say, studies gain no financial support and therefore are delegitimized, seriously distorting the overall picture and idea of what gender studies are or should be. So one of the important areas of struggle for gender studies is further dismantling and harsh critique of this neoliberal university with its monetization of research and turning education from public good into a service. Therefore, I think it's very important to open up for problems, approaches, issues, and researchers that have not so far been visible, taken for granted, into account, heard, and that could offer an alternative view of the traditional complacency that I mentioned above. It's crucial that instead of defending gender studies disciplinary boundaries and following this divide and rule modern colonial game, we go more in the direction of collaborations with other areas of critical thinking and agency to be able and willing to hear the others and try to genuinely learn more about their lives, subjectivities, and positionalities. So this transversality, this bottom-up dimension from what we do, teach, think is very important to keep, of course. And that is the opposite of the tendency that I find very problematic today. Lewis Gordon calls it disciplinary decadence. So it's like proliferation of more and more narrow disciplines, micro disciplines that fail to hear each other, take an interest in each other, lose the meaning of their common shared gender studies agenda. So that I find important. And one last thing, of course, the recipe for me is very decolonial. Again, it comes from the preeminent decolonial feminist Maria Lugones, who attempted to fight this dead-endish condition with the idea of deep coalitions. She says that the deep coalitions never reduce multiplicity. They span across differences. Aware of particular configurations of oppression, they are not fixed on them, but strive beyond into the world towards a shared struggle of interrelated others. So this is what I still find very important to keep in mind when we talk about gender studies today, or when we try to imagine their future. And again, if we speak of Europe, there should be less power asymmetries between the core Europe, so to say, and the Central and Eastern European internal others, or on a broader scale, the European gender research and advocacy imposing itself in a missionary role in the global South, in semi-periphery or internal other spaces such as migrant communities or refugee communities. This should also be in focus. So our societal impact should be radically rethought to avoid following this populist path of indulging the public and grant hunting, and rather going in the direction of formulating together and thinking together with the most responsible citizens and critically thinking citizens on the possible agendas for refuturing of this world, attracting the attention of the societies to possibly hard-hitting and therefore unpopular phenomena that require collective self-critique and also action to redirect our lives in a more just way and in a more sustainable way. Thank you.
Anika, you certainly have also your perspective, critique, or perhaps a message for us.
Yeah, but
academia.
I was now very much intrigued by what Madina Tlostanova said, so and triggered a lot of thoughts. And I don't want to follow my notes, just on the side, because I was thinking about where I was in the past 13 years in this university at the Polish-German border lands, in a small university where we do not have a discipline gender studies, and we do not have a discipline anthropology, but students studied cultural sciences, and there was a time that was quite a few years ago where the faculty cultural sciences actually had to think what we can offer to our students. What is the particular perspective of cultural sciences when it's a cultural science that is taught and researched by political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists. Gender studies, there is only half a chair is gender studies, which has so and it reminds me that I usually thought of gender studies not as a discipline, but as a way of thinking and a way of living. And the same is with anthropology. I see it as a way of thinking and a way of living. And so I still call myself an anthropologist, even though I'm not in academia anymore. And so that was really some thoughts that came up to me right now when I heard you talking. And I think that it's so difficult. And I found it difficult in the university to have gender studies incorporated in the kinds of studies that were offered there. And I think that this is a very specific experience, which we cannot even generalize for Germany. So when I make suggestions of what I think should be more included in our teaching, that was one question, or in our research, I think it's very specific to what I experienced and learned and thought in the past years, and my interactions with the students and what I learned from my students. Not only because they asked me certain questions, but because I also saw what is the kind of thinking that seems less historical. I think, and I found that was one of the main problems, that the time span students think shortened. So that it's like what was 20 years ago seems like a long time ago. And then I think, well, I'm not that old. It's only 25 years ago that I started my studies. And back then we didn't even talk about queer theory, not in ethnology, at least in European ethnology. So for me, that seems like a very short time, but for them, it seems like a very long time. So there are some clashes. So when I thought about what we should include more in teaching, and in particularly in teaching, now I will limit myself to that, I thought we need to include more history of feminist theory and gender studies in the curricula. And we need to teach the development and trajectory of women and gender studies and the history of critical feminist theories, and teach the trajectory of gender from being read and understood as woman to social gender, and finally to interrogating and deconstructing the binary gender system. And at the same time, we need to bring back gender as a historic category and inquire into what it came to signify, but also to be open to new understandings of its social meaning and discuss that. Also learning from students and other people and networks, because I think there are vast differences in these countries. We hear that even now. So, and I think what I was always interested in and I could never follow was to initiate research projects on knowledge production on gender in different disciplines. What kind of knowledge do disciplines produce around knowledge? And how does philosophy and social sciences and gender studies and deconstructive perspectives contribute in other disciplines? Be it in law, as Sabine, Beate, you mentioned that they are using old-fashioned things which we can hardly listen to in law and in practice even, probably. And what is about biology or psychology particularly, or psychoanalysis? So I think that would be really interesting. Thank you.
I'm not quite sure what to add to this discussion, but I think it's so many points are made, which I totally agree on. First of all, is when I'm talking from the perspective of gender studies, it's not as a discipline as well. Even so, I think in Germany, the development of gender studies towards a discipline is there, and I'm not sure whether it's the best what happens at the moment. But I think, as Anika, that it's much more intervened in or entangled with different knowledge productions in different disciplinary fields of knowledge. And as European ethnology and gender studies are both declare themselves as being transdisciplinary in a certain way, and more are going for a certain way of thinking. And I totally agree with Anika that to say it this way. I think what we can do is to teach to be very self-reflective on the one side, and to see to have not self-reflective in this positionality discourse of being personal positioned only, but positioned as well with the concepts and theories we are working with, that they have an impact of how we see the world in a way, and they have a worlding effect, and that is what we can teach, to make people sensitive to these processes, to think with care about things, and not, I mean, it's in either direction, I think. And I totally agree with what Paula Willer yesterday said. We need very thorough, and Anika said it in her first statement as well, we need empirical research and very differentiate and on different scales with different approaches. And so we need more, yes, we need to make our hands dirty with empirical research, and not only in our bubble and our feeling well communities, but as well in areas where it's not nice to be. I mean, to know, to understand better what happens there. And I very much appreciate as well what Betül said about that certain discourses have give subject positions which are very rational and very logic for certain people. And we do have to understand this better, I think, if we want to critique them. It doesn't make sense to critique from an outside position at these points. And what I think we need as well is a much more collaborative approaches, as well across national borders, I think, and as well as between academia and non-academic or academic and with groups and communities and NGOs, but not losing our own approaches in it, I think. I mean, yes, I think it's a difficult between, or what we distinguish sometimes as collaboration and co-laboration, as to give reflective rooms as well for those we work with, as to critique them as well, and not only to go with the people we work with. Yes, I'm not sure. Maybe we could just go for this discussion the rest of the time, though we have
just was about to write. Exactly. I just was about writing in the chat function that please use this chat function, and please use it in a way that everybody can see your questions. And please indicate with a hand raising symbol that you want to take part personally, orally in our discussion. Now we still have some time. I know you have been waiting for quite a long time, but as there are various voices, I don't think that. Here we have the first question. Oh, it's quite long. A question for Madina. Madina, do you see the chat function yourself, or should I read the question to you?
Oh, sorry, I'm opening it. Let me see. Okay, shall I read it, or?
Perhaps, yeah, I think.
Okay. The usefulness debate shows the special position of gender studies as a particularly questioned interdisciplinary subject because it's not so strongly applied to other sciences. The argument of usefulness is, of course, a double-edged sword, which has, however, to be discussed before the background of the fact of academia being situated in political preconditions. On one hand, we are supporting the commodification and neoliberalization of academia. On the other hand, we aim to deepen the understanding of the people still not part of anti-genderist publics, but who are skeptical how to win hearts and minds, how to counteract the devaluation of gender studies in order to be able to survive. For the application for third-party funding is also a part of survival. Yeah, it's a very, very long and important and complicated question. Of course, that is impossible to answer in 30 seconds, which I probably have. But again, I mean, it's probably not for me, the question, because I don't play this game, to tell you the truth. Again, as a decolonial scholar, I don't play games with neoliberal universities. I don't think it's important to get grants. I think it's important to do research and activism. That is more important than trying to find these balances. And what I was referring to as a lacking or shrinking academic freedom is precisely that, because in Sweden, this is how it works. All research is only grants supported, so you have to apply for it. And so people who sit in these places, they decide which research is, gets money and which not, but then you are completely delegitimized or whatever you do. For me, it's particularly funny because, I come from Russia, where I spent most of my research, like almost 20 years as a professor there before. And it's funny because I always did research on the side. I could get any kind of grants from Russian organizations, which didn't mean anything for me. And all my radical research that was important for me as a researcher, I was doing on the side at night, during vacations. And these are the books that made me known, in a sense. So that's why, for me, this whole system is very inefficient, and unsustainable. But at the same time, I think that's what I refer to. We need to rethink what societal impact means. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean. It shouldn't be, explained to us and imposed on us by the people who are today in power to decide what is important in societal terms and what is not. But unfortunately, we are very much constrained by these, preconceived ideas of how can we be useful. And this refers not only to gender studies, but also to humanities that are shrinking in the neoliberal university and getting less and less money. But I always give this example. Humanities are important because we are all human beings, and it doesn't matter what kind of research we do. We can do mathematics or engineering, but we still have a responsibility because we are human in front of other humans, other species, the planet, the society. And so questioning humanities is as stupid as questioning gender studies, which of course is again a very good example of that. But I am not the right person to ask this because I don't have a recipe. I'm not successful in neoliberal academia.
Are there more questions? Please take the chance, take the time. As long as you are thinking about the next question, I would have a question to Andrea, because in fact, or also to Betül, because I'm always asking myself, should we not get better prepared? If you are looking back to the times when you had, or when the situation got really worse and you decided to go or to leave or to be expelled, certainly you thought, oh, what did you miss collectively, or would have there been the chance to respond differently towards the changes, the developments, the transformations academically? As an academic, and perhaps also politically as a networked academic. So I'm really wondering, what are your thoughts on that? What is your take on that? Perhaps a little bit as well as a kind of a warning.
Yeah, thank you, Sabine. With some colleagues, we are doing a podcast series with the title Sleepwalking from Democracy. And I think that this will be done by historians, because what we see around us very often with those who are working on Holocaust, genocide, horrible past, we have seen that before, and it did not end well. So, of course, doing historical analogies is extremely dangerous, but we don't have any other heuristic tools, but use what we have seen before and try to, think if this is applicable, yes, no, why? This is a very simple methodology, but that's why what was very interesting to hear what Madina was saying, that how in Putin's Russia, she developed a strategy of working during night and preserving herself and her sanity, which actually brought her a tenure professorship in Sweden. Yeah. So I just would like to say that this is the strategy which is coming from the communist times, that people performing and self-censoring what is happening in the public sphere, and they are using the private and redefining the private, what we call private, as a space for empowerment and the space for protest, and there is this concept of the semi-private public space by Habermas, which turned to be the most successful space for resisting before the French Revolution, during the 19th century, and also during the communist time. So the flying universities, for example, those universities which were held in private apartments, and then there were nothing about the impact factors or teaching outcomes or whatever, but this was sheer intellectual joy. My people joined this thing, but this has got a kind of limited use, because if you are imprisoned and killed, like in Turkey or now sometimes in Russia today, that is really not very helpful. So it has a limit how long you can do this game, right? So, and it's not an accident that Madina also left Russia, right? So this is there is a limit how long you can play, inside, outside, how you can play this system. So I think Adorno was right when he was saying that there is no, I should quote it more properly, but when he's saying that there is not a good life in a horrible system. What is the real quote? I mean, you should know that. So, I mean, there is a limit how long you can collaborate.
Es gibt nichts Wahres im Falschen.
Yeah, exactly. That was what I was trying to recall. So there is a limit, but how much you can create this space. But I started with the concept of sleepwalking. And I see that, this idea that power is not important, that, there won't be any challenge to academic system and the already existing institutions. And we will tell the people how they should think, and they will think in this way. I mean, this kind of enlightened hubris actually led to this present situation. And unfortunately, when I'm looking at the reactions of feminist studies scholars or gender studies scholars nowadays, there's a reaction. And Madina also pointed out one of these very problematic strategies, that we will prove, how successful we are. I mean, this is basically the same dead-end circle. So this is not really, and we explain them what gender is, and then the problem will go away. Right? I mean, this kind of attitude and this kind of strategy is a non-strategy. That I would call is a part of the sleepwalking. And it's really not rocket science. I'm sorry to say that. I mean, you have got these warning signs. I mean, we know that. I mean, we know it from the communist takeover. We know it from the Nazi takeover. We know it from how the Salazar's authoritarian military dictatorship remained in power for decades. I mean, it's pretty obvious how this is working, right? And I'm really surprised that we are not more advanced thinking about strategies how to fight against this kind of dark ideas. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Sabina, for the question. For me, it's not just theoretical or analytical question, but also a very emotional one. As I experienced a kind of expel or forced migration, and I also experienced two different academic systems. Back in Turkey, we have faced with all these forces and regressive forces and attacks in the name of building better society without us, but And recently I have listened some new news that the government is planning to establish a women's university, university only for women. This is a vague project at the moment, but it has been discussed before, and it's discussed recently again, and now it calmed down, but I'm sure it will reappear in the public discussion. So it's very interesting to see all these dynamics as a gender studies, as an academics, an activist, focusing on gender issues. Because as I said in my presentation, it's not just one-dimensional, it's more dynamic than what we are going through is more dynamic than the analysis that most of the time are reactionary rather than, as Beate said, rather than understanding the whole different positions and intimately understanding the position. It's more reactionary at the moment, and this is blocking us to understand the present ongoing situation and the way how they manage to gain support from a large section of society. That's one of the crucial questions I think we have to focus on. And in reflecting back on my experience of being expelled from Turkey, I realized that it's not only the regressive government that I was facing with. I have been actually experiencing before that lots of different mobbings or other forms of attacks. And this was allowed in the context of neoliberal academia. And I was feeling that I was lonely, not just because of the strongness of the attack that have been going through when I was there, but also surrounded by neoliberal academic mentalities. I mean, so the whole neoliberal context has already prepared a kind of ground for this attack to be able to successful in a way. So this is one experience I wanted to share with you in terms of understanding the whole problematic, which how big is the problematic than only the authoritarian government itself. And coming to German context, German academic context, from a very highly political Turkish context, where I was actively engaged in gender politics or queer politics, I found myself in a very bizarre situation. In a way, on the one hand, I was considered as highly political, too political in a way, by the German academia in some ways. And I saw the distinction between academia and activism so clear-cut in the German context. And I found escaping from this type of risk, I found in the context of new forms of risks, which I'm writing on this issue now as an exiled scholar, risks that are being, coming from hierarchical epistemologies between West and East or South and North, and coming from an Eastern country, etc. As an academic, to what extent I can be recognized by, Western framework. And this is one, but neoliberalism in different forms are such dominance in German context too, depending precarity, high level of precarity, project dependence, etc., etc. You all know about this, but it's sharp for me to experience this as a person who is in exile in Germany. So, but gender has unique connotation and position within all this framework, I would say, gender studies, because it is shrinking, as you already mentioned, in all of the all of parts of the world in various countries, including Germany. But this sharp distinction between politics and doing neutral science is rather strong. That's what my impression is, and very dangerously used by authoritarian or radical right at the moment, claiming that gender, racism, anti-racist studies are not really science, but pseudoscience. So that is somehow we have to discuss, I suppose, in our panel. And it goes back to earlier experience of fascism, I suppose, because somehow people are feeling, feeling too much engagement in politics is dangerous, as in the case of fascism. So that kind of memories are still very strong in the German context, I would say. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think we produced today again so much food for thought, and so many loose, points are around, but we won't manage to round them up in a I think satisfying way. Unfortunately, not today. But on the other hand, perhaps what's a promising thing is that we have much to talk about and should come together much more often. And I think there is a need also to get more practical somehow in a way of how to establish this kinds of collaborations, building this kind of bridges, and learning also from your other experiences. And probably you are far ahead perhaps of us, and I don't want to build analogies, and I'm also, I think we should be quite differentiate and don't build this kind of analogies. But on the other hand, I think we should look and don't sleepwalk. So I think it's a really, really good way to call it sleepwalking. But the promising thing is that we have another day tomorrow. So we start tomorrow, or we continue our conference and with a fishbowl and discussing different perspective of cultural anthropology, political anthropology, and gender studies. And therefore, I think we just continue or take some of these really big questions and challenges for us for the next round tomorrow and to our next meetings. I'm very grateful, and I thank you all in the audience for your patience, and I'm very grateful and delighted to have you here as experts with your experiences and your patience as well. And it's not simple to cut it short in 5 minutes or in 3 minutes. I know you all have to say much more. So thanks again for this kind of format. And I wish you all a nice evening. We have again a Wonder Me room. Please look at the chat. So here we go again. We have here the link to the Wonder Me, and who wants to meet and go on discussing topics in an informal way, please copy and paste the link and we meet there in some seconds. Thank you very much. And normally I would pass over this kind of flowers to you all. Normally we do it, or hand over a bottle of wine. Unfortunately, today I just can do it in this way, virtually, but please feel having this flowers in your own hand. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.